Are we live streaming? We haven't done this setup before. Am I waiting for a video to stop to give the introduction, or when do we start?
Let's hold on. Gonna start.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, friends. Welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be exploring the topic, how are parenting time and access determined in separations? Voice of Men 360 is a nonprofit organization founded in 2020 and based in Toronto, Canada. Voice of Men 360 was born out of seeing a tremendous need for stepping up to provide services to help support and overcome men and boys' life challenges. We are part of International Men's Day. International Men's Day has been serving for over 21 years, so far 90 countries around the world. We're joined together for various activities regularly. International Men's Day follows 6 pillars, which is the overall well-being of boys and men. We follow in the same footsteps. We hold these monthly webinars to create awareness on topics such as this, with the hopes of sharing valuable information and talking more conceptually. Our Open Up show is more about connecting with people. This is more about connecting with topics and ideas. So before I introduce our guests today, I have to go through some disclaimers. We would like to remind you that Voice of Men 360's mission is always delivered in good faith towards peaceful harmony. The views and opinions expressed in today's episode are exclusively those of the speakers and do not represent Voice of Men 360. Our organization engages in discussion forums to offer inspiration and create awareness to the issues of men who wish to overcome their life challenges. We are not providing medical advice, therapeutic advice, or personal legal advice, even if we're lawyers. Should you require that type of assistance, we recommend you contact the appropriate professionals and get the right help you need. If you have any questions about today's show, put it on our comments on whatever platform you're watching this on, and feel free to join the conversation. So today, we are talking with Michael Burry, who's a lawyer in the Toronto area. With over 25 years in the legal profession, Michael has provided his clients with exceptional results, combined with a cost-effective approach to solving legal problems. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in English and Philosophy from University of Toronto in 1988, before earning his Bachelor of Law from Western in 1991, and his Master of Law from Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto in 2003. Mr. Burry's legal practice is focused on family law representation, often fathers in need of help, to ensure their interests are protected in a challenging and often difficult to navigate court system. His approach is always an attempt to negotiate first in order to minimize legal costs, but he's also prepared to go into court as a strong advocate when required. Thank you for coming out today. And this is a really important topic to discuss with men, because it can be pretty threatening to be facing up against these things, right? So feel free to introduce anything you want to talk about at the start.
Great. Well, thanks for having me today. Thank the hosts, and thanks, Will, for helping moderate this. You're absolutely right. Parenting time is a very emotional subject for everyone. You know, it's bad enough that your relationship often has fallen apart and you're in a conflict with your former partner. But then sometimes where there's children involved, you have these little faces looking up to you, looking up to dad, looking up to mom, trying to figure out what's going on. How is my world going to look like when I have parents living separate and apart? So it's challenging, it's difficult. As the topic suggests, parenting time quite literally means the time you have as a parent with your child when they're living between often 2 homes. Parenting time, if the child is with you and the child is in school, for example, that's also parenting time. Now, before we started, we were talking about how do you get parenting time? Well, in family law in Ontario and Canada generally, parenting time can be either negotiated informally between the parents once after they're separated. I have had cases where everyone's actually decent to each other and is ready to move on and keep the best interests of the kids in place. So it can be negotiated informally. It can be negotiated more formally in a separation agreement, for example. And finally, it can be imposed by a court through a family court order after the court hears evidence from both sides and sometimes relatives. The bottom line for the courts always will be the children's best interests. You've probably heard that phrase. Some people kind of gloss over it or don't really focus on it because they're too busy hating each other, the parents fighting. But judges really listen to who has the child's best interests at stake. I've had cases where the child becomes a chess piece in this battle where the mother, for example, will do everything to deny access, will do everything to try to alienate the children. Just nasty business. But at the end of the day, the judge is going to be putting all the behaviors of the adults under a microscope. And typically, the good guy is the person who, or the good woman, is the person who says, look, what's going on between me and my former partners, between us? Everyone's got a mom, everyone's got a dad, everyone's entitled to both. So, making sure there's that parenting time is very important. One other aspect, before I'll let you ask me some questions now. Another aspect of parenting time is for non-parents. So, we're talking now about parenting time in terms of parents, but often there's extended family and grandparents, uncles, aunts, extended family. They can also apply for something that's called a contact order. That's something that a court will grant. I've seen cases, for example, where grandparents aren't being allowed to see their own grandkids. So they have recourse to the courts too, to make sure they have contact with their grandchildren or nieces, nephews.
Well, it's funny you said that it could be court ordered, but I think that parenting shouldn't be something that has to be court ordered. And it's kind of sad from my perspective that it gets there so often. But to your point about what you're saying is every other weekend seems to be a bit of a default. And when I was growing up coaching hockey, on the weekend that it was mom's time, hockey's a dad thing. So their kids wouldn't show up every other week, even if they loved hockey and they were a star on the team. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So often, like the kids actually get pulled into the fighting, and it's like hearing dad's awful while he's over here and hearing mom's awful while he's over there at dad's, right? Like, how, in the cases that you've seen that have gone better and haven't gone the whole petty route, are there anything that helps that? Like, are there factors that are risk factors? Like, is drug and alcohol something that makes it escalate more? Is cheating something that escalates more? Or like what makes it go more legal and less civil?
Well, typically what makes it go more legal, meaning showing up at court, apart from, any child abuse allegations or any fights between the parents, if there's something to suggest either parent can effectively provide the care a child needs, as you alluded to, if someone's an alcoholic and it's out of control or has other issues which may impact on providing care for the child, then obviously that'll be looked at closely by the courts. Now, I just want to roll back the tape on something you said. You talked about, the every other weekend or the weekend dad. I really can't stand that concept. I think the courts in the past have kind of defaulted to that somehow. I still haven't figured out how historically that's come to be, but it seems that in the past, well, you should consider yourself lucky if you got every other weekend or you got one overnight on Saturday. that I completely disagree with that. My starting point in all my cases is 50-50, okay, 50-50 parenting time. And often lawyers on the other side are kind of puzzled and shocked by such a suggestion. And I say, well, why shouldn't it be? The default should be 50-50 unless you can convince me or a judge why it shouldn't be 50-50. And it's kind of surreal that I'm still encountering these attitudes. I had one case, for example, where, younger child, parents, are going through a separation process. Father's left the matrimonial home, mother stays there. So father quite sensibly, for example, proposed, well, why don't we have a nesting arrangement? And what that means is, instead of the child being bounced around between homes, parents move in and out on a weekly basis. In this case, for example, both parents had their own parents living relatively close. So this person suggested to his partner, well, why don't we just move out on a weekly basis? It's convenient. We're not like moving houses. We're just taking our personal stuff, coming back. And the other side was just kind of scratching their head and saying, "What? How can you even suggest such a thing?" So there's a lot of attitude shift that needs to happen. It is happening. It's just very slow.
So how do you do that when families are struggling to afford a house in the first place, right? Like cost of living is not low right now. So
Right.
having an apartment and a mortgage for a house in Southern Ontario, that's
crazy.
150 grand a year at least.
Right. No, of course. And in some cases, obviously everything depends on people's personal situations. In some cases, for example, the partner who's left or the husband, often, his parents may have a huge house which has lots of space, right? And that's completely appropriate, right? For him to go, he can go live with his parents while the child's with the mother, and then the mother can go live with her parents. But you're absolutely right. Every situation is different, and it depends on, what everyone can afford. In this particular case, they could afford separate premises or had their parents close by. But if you don't have that luxury, then you're right. You're stuck with having to have your own place anyways, right? And then hopefully the child is old enough that, you can push for the 50-50. But the bottom line is you have to make sure your arrangement where you're living is suitable for a child, like their own room, their own space, clothing. You're effectively setting up a separate household for the child, which obviously is expensive too. But, at the end of the day, I'll keep repeating it, best interests of the child.
I'm glad you keep saying that. You keep another thing, a word that came up before was allegations, right? And a big part of the legal process from friends I've had go through divorces mostly seems to be taking turns trying to slander each other until something sticks, right?
Right.
So what factors are legitimate in like deciding custody time, and what factors are just things that people say that are noise that don't actually stick?
Well, again, if let's talk from the perspective of a judge. If I'm looking at a case trying to determine parenting time, I'm going to look to any police involvement, and judges get it. They get these cases every day. They can smell false allegations versus real allegations. Obviously, a push and shoving match, a one-off type incident isn't going to determine where the child ends up for the rest of their lives, right? So again, there's safeguards built in, but at the same time, every judge is different, and you may get the case where, for example, they side with the partner making the allegations versus the person at the receiving end of false allegations. The bottom line is to always, document everything as you're going through this process. If you are at the receiving end of an assault, document it. You have bruises, you have scratches, you had a plate thrown at you, document. Unfortunately, the courts have a difficult job if it's a he says, she says, and there's no external evidence. So, if the neighbors heard the fight and saw you running out with something being thrown at you, document. At the end of the day, it's evidence. Often, the CAS will often become involved where there's a criminal charges alleged in cases. So they'll conduct a full investigation too. And, they can be a double-edged sword. Don't get me wrong. They don't always get it right, but at least there's an external party involved beyond the police. Another agency that can sometimes get involved when you're, within the court system is the Office of the Children's Lawyer. That is an independent office that the court relies on to conduct its own investigation of what's going on in the household and with the kids. So they will, the court will order them to become involved. They'll investigate, they'll interview the kids if they're old enough, and provide yet another objective, typically picture for the judge. So again, document.
So you mentioned the neighbors being like neighbor testimony mattering and stuff like that. Like if you're a man and you yell louder, wouldn't that bias that against men?
Well, it's not a question of, louder. It's a question of, again, evidence. So if something happens and you have other family members present or in the house, getting affidavits from them as to what they heard can assist you. You never want to find yourself in the he says, she says position, because it's a very difficult one to be in, quite honestly. Now, in the criminal context, theoretically, if a judge has two different versions of the events and he's or she is still scratching their head as to what happened, then they're obliged to make a finding of not guilty. But everyone's human, and it's difficult. So if you have any other evidence to support your position, it's always helpful.
So, Michael, when you're looking at the concept of in the best interest of the child,
yes,
and you had said previously that the judge carefully weighs both parents' situation. Why is it that in most cases custody is awarded to the mother?
Right. Well, fortunately, we no longer have that terminology. There was federal legislation passed to eliminate the concept of custody. So that term no longer exists. I know a lot of people still use it, but that is gone from our legal vocabulary. What we have now is parenting time, which I think is a good move on the part of the legislators, because, custody makes it sound like, okay, this is a piece of property. This kid, it's a piece of property. I'm his or her jailer. It's something to control, versus parenting time really reflects what's supposed to be happening. Who has more parenting time? And yeah, it's difficult if you're the dad, you're out of the matrimonial home, you don't have the nice room for the child, you don't have, because you're just getting off your feet, literally. It's tough. It's a tough situation to be in. And I'm suspecting that as a result of, because it's often the men who end up leaving the matrimonial home, it takes a while to reestablish yourself. So in those cases, sometimes what was called custody and is now parenting time shifts temporarily towards the mother. But you have to remember, none of this is etched in stone. People seem to think that
Shut the fuck up.
Once there's an order. No, I think.
Yes, nigga, shut your little bitch ass up, you dirty bitch. Good ass nigga named Miss Mary. Shut your little bitch ass up, you ugly ass nigga.
That's fun.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Sorry,
Not
go ahead.
entirely sure, maybe not a satisfied customer, who knows? In any event, we were talking about parenting time. So again, courts, the overriding position of the judge is best interest. Where can the child have a good quality of life? And, hopefully dad focuses on building that versus hating his former partner. I find in many cases, the emotions just keep going and going and going. And dads often lose sight of the fact that, okay, I got to focus on the child now and on myself. Self-care is a big part of it. I often recommend dads to take co-parenting courses. There are families in transition, for example, in Toronto, and I think other offices, they have offers a great course. And it's a sliding scale in terms of fees. So it's a United Way organization. So they will take into account your personal situation. But it's a great idea to take a co-parenting course, because let's face it, after a divorce or separation, you're now in the business of raising this child. Whether you like the other person or not, you got to raise this kid, and the kid has to have a mom and dad, unless there's some extremely bad reason that they shouldn't have contact with the other parent. But at the end of the day, it's like, okay, I'm in the business of co-parenting this child. So focusing on yourself and putting aside all those angry emotions goes a long way with the courts.
I have a question from a lawyer here. Have you ever come across information about how many family law custody court cases result in a court decision versus a confidential settlement agreement?
I don't know if those stats exist. I just from the perspective of what those two things are, I tell my clients often, once you've reached the courthouse door, you've often lost the case before it even starts. Because let's face it, you're putting your future in the hands of this person sitting up there as the judge. They don't know you. They'll look at your file briefly before court or before a trial, if that's the case, and you're leaving everything up to a stranger to decide. Typically, no one is happy with the outcome after a trial or after a motion in front of a judge, because you just don't know what's going to happen. I always recommend either negotiation between lawyers to get to a separation agreement, or even if you're not ready for a separation agreement, it can even be a parenting time agreement, or if need be, go to private mediation. There's a whole range of mediators out there. They'll work with you, they get to know both sides. The more time is spent, it's more personalized. And in most cases, you'll come out with a better outcome than just throwing it at a judge, unless it's an extreme case and we know what the outcome is typically going to be. But for cases where it's could go either way, negotiate or mediate.
Can you give, or rather, can you elaborate on what a confidential settlement agreement is?
Well, I don't know what terminology this person is getting that from, but a settlement agreement is basically like a separation agreement where it can take into account all the factors that the parties want to resolve without having to go to court. So for example, if there's a matrimonial home, one partner can buy the other partner out when they're equalizing property, or they can agree to sell the house. There's any number of things that can go into such an agreement. If the person's thinking about minutes of settlement, they're basically the same type of document, except it's a document that's filed in court and then becomes a court order if everyone agrees that a court order is required. In terms of confidentiality, I haven't seen any, certainly none of my agreements, no one has requested confidentiality because they're being negotiated between two sides, and I don't think anyone really wants to broadcast the terms of their agreement. The other problem becomes if they do, what's your remedy? You're going to go to court and say, okay, they broke the confidentiality agreement, so what's your remedy, right? I think that may be more of a US type term than a Canadian term. I just don't come across it in the agreements I do. Most people.
We have a question here from the audience I was going to try and get to.
Sure.
So it says, hi, my question is regarding false criminal assault allegations laid by wife. Wife keeps verbally saying she would like to withdraw and has said it to the police. And basically once it's been said, it's can't be withdrawn. And says would not go to court when called. And can the wife, husband, and children all willingly choose to leave Canada and submit their intentions in writing? Can you share your views around this, please?
Okay, I'll share my views with the caveat that it's not legal advice because I don't know your specific case. But generally speaking, it's a very common situation where, you know, domestic assault charges are made the next day or next few days. The partner who made the allegation regrets making the allegation or wants to have the charges withdrawn, for example. At the end of the day, the person who makes that decision is the Crown Attorney, regardless of what the complainant's position is. However, I have had cases where the complainant will hire his or her own lawyer, prepare an affidavit, which is a sworn document, setting out their position. I just had one the other day where, the wife was actually charged, but the husband wanted to have contact with her again because she's expecting a child. And what he did, we prepared a statement, an affidavit, and in that affidavit, he essentially says, without getting into the details of what happened, didn't happen, I wish to have contact with my partner. I don't fear them. I want to help them. I've always been supportive. And that then is presented to the Crown, and the Crown can then make a decision whether to vary the condition of release, whether it's a bail release or an undertaking release from the police station. And in many cases, if there's not serious injuries or a history, for example, the Crowns are pretty good about consenting to those types of changes so that people can get back together pending the resolution of the case. In other similar situations, the partner may say, look, I don't want my partner to have a criminal record, for example, and the Crown will consider whether a peace bond is appropriate, meaning the charge is withdrawn and the party who's been charged agrees to keep the peace for 12 months, for example. It's a document they sign. In terms of, I think the other part of the question was whether or not to show up in court or to leave Canada, for example. Obviously, it depends on the stage of the case. If you've received a subpoena to come to a trial as a witness against your partner and you ignore the subpoena, then potentially they could send a police car to the residence where you live to find you and bring you to the trial, or they could issue a warrant for your arrest. It's called a material witness warrant because you didn't show up for trial as a witness in the case. So it can get quite serious. I don't think I'd recommend simply everyone leaving the country because it'll create problems for everyone. So the accused person, for example, if they don't show up in court, will have a warrant issued for their arrest in all likelihood. The person who's supposed to be a witness, if a trial date's already set, could face a material witness warrant. So it can get very messy.
Okay, so we have a follow-up question to that one. They said, I understand an affidavit can be drafted and submitted. Can all family members be allowed to leave the country post submitting an affidavit? Discussion with the Crown?
Well, it depends on what's been agreed to by the Crown. There's certainly nothing, if you're talking family members, whether children can leave, I don't know this particular case, but certainly there's nothing preventing your kids from leaving the country if everyone's in agreement with that. Again, you really shouldn't do anything until you have a final decision that's communicated to you by the Crown, whether the Crown's going to withdraw the case or whether the Crown's going to require a peace bond. Like taking off before anything's decided is never recommended. It'll just cause you bigger problems than you started with.
And kidnapping your kids and all that nonsense too that we're not talking about right now. Like there's a lot of knee-jerk moves people do in that reaction that's not the right move.
Right.
So I guess what could you do, or if you're going to make an agreement about parenting time, not custody,
Right.
Would that be an agreement that's better made with your marriage proposal or your marriage agreement contract, or is that something that you could do at the time of having a baby?
Well, I guess you can do it anytime. It's difficult to do it in anticipation of having children, obviously. this whole issue of parenting time is typically arises post breakup versus at the beginning of a relationship. When people get together, everything's usually rosy, everyone's in love. Sometimes they do have these cohabitation agreements or marriage contracts, and those really deal more with the property issues between them. They're not really thinking long term about, if we have kids, this is what will happen to the kids. It's kind of hard to think about that or predict. You don't know what the child's needs are going to be until they actually show up in the world, and you're in this post-separation process. So I don't normally see it before the children arrive being negotiated. They're not turning their minds to that because there's no kids, right? So they're just not thinking about that. If they separate and there are kids, then that's the best time to obviously sit down and say, okay, this is how we're going to negotiate parenting time. And don't forget, parenting time doesn't mean just weekends or 50-50 or whatever the arrangement is. Parenting time also includes the holidays, the summer holidays, March break. You can get as granular as who gets them for Halloween this year, who gets Thanksgiving. All of that, really should be looked at if those holidays, have a meaning to either parent. I find sometimes people forget about that, and then that's where things can get messy. So parenting time includes, the birthday of the child, the parent's birthday. Is the child going to be with the parent on their birthday? There's so many things that fall under the caption of parenting time. So it's always important to think about all that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also becomes like a negotiation thing where they're all chips on the table and no one wants to give anything up because that's giving something to their ex, and that's just like petty.
Yeah.
So I guess the question I have is, like, when couples are on the rocks, I don't want to use that when they're having tough times, not lovey-dovey all the time. Is there something that's like between couples counseling and mediation that's sort of like between mending and amicably separating?
Yeah, it's called co-parenting courses, or even hiring a parenting coordinator. A parenting coordinator is typically a professional. They're often a social worker. And basically what you're doing is you're hiring a coach, a referee, both a coach and a referee. So for dispute resolution, if you're finding there's more and more disputes and things are just getting ugly, but again, you're not at separation, you're not at going to court, you just want to figure out how to deal with these parenting issues, then there's any number of third parties that can help you navigate that. And again, it's keeping the children's best interests in mind by, both sides agreeing, okay, we're stuck on this issue. It's just going to get ugly if we don't do something about it. Let's take a co-parenting course, or let's hire a parenting coordinator to make these decisions for us. It can be very helpful.
So I'm going to talk about a hypothetical here. We're officially into not adulting very well category, not really communicating very well, not really taking accountability for making peace in your home at this point. But if you're a man and you're sleeping on a futon in the basement of your house that you're paying for, and your wife doesn't even work, you're supporting the household, sole income, and that's used against you because you're never home because you're always working. Right now, the fear is that you're going to see your kid every other weekend. You're going to have garnished wages if you don't make child support payments, and you're going to go to jail if you don't. And you're never going to be able to afford a house even close to what you have, even if it's just a basement with a futon in it.
Right.
And so that's one extreme. I'm not saying that's the norm anymore. Obviously, women make a lot more than men in a lot of instances, especially with the coming generations. And if you look at things like graduation rates and grad school attendance right now and stuff like that, women are very, very strongly represented there. And so intergenerationally, they're going to be more qualified in 30 years late in their careers, right? But if you're that guy and you're the breadwinner right now, what of those fears are statistically like in case law
Mhm.
is favored women? Like what of those fears are valid and what of those fears are not valid and just fears that aren't true anymore?
Well, it's hard to say because every single case is determined on its very specific facts, right? But there are certainly legitimate fears to have. Traditionally, it's been, especially if the children are younger, it's been, the dad who leaves the matrimonial home, the dad who has to reestablish himself with new premises, new residence. So that's certainly terrifying. I still think that exists today. In terms of, the income issue, yeah, all of a sudden, if you're not getting 50-50 or at least 40% of the parenting time, then right, child support's going to kick in. So these are all legitimate fears. I think you have to focus on, minimizing the impact of those situations. For example, again, self-care is huge. If you don't take care of yourself, whether it's emotionally, physically, financially, then that's going to impact on in all likelihood, what kind of parenting time you get. So it's very important. And, I think we're very bad at taking care of ourselves, I find, whether it's financially, whether it's emotionally, whether it's physically, especially if you're going through conflict with a partner. But you got to make that priority one. You will get through it, you will survive, but you have to put the supports in place, right? So the financial supports, the extended family supports, all of that's very important to have going for you when you're going through the process. And once again, I'll go back to it, like co-parenting, it's going to be huge. If you can show, I've taken the course, I've read these books, I'm prepared to co-parent, that puts you way ahead of the game and kind of puts you closer to that 50% or 40% versus the weekend type situation where you just, I'll take whatever time I can get with the kid. And that's kind of a sad place to be.
That is definitely a sad place to be. Yeah, do we have any other more questions from anyone else that's on the call that wants to speak up?
I got a question here, if I could just ask. If a home is going through some trauma between the husband and wife, and there's a kid involved, but it hasn't escalated beyond to involve any legal matters in question, and the wife asked the husband to leave the home, is he legally obligated to do so?
No, he's not legally obliged to leave the home if he's asked to leave the home, especially if it's a home owned jointly or if it's leased together. Even if it's not leased together, it's the matrimonial home, whether it's they rent it or they own it. It's his home as much as it is her home. So no, he can't be forced to leave. He can't be asked to leave. Unfortunately, I find what happens is that this is where we come up with these assault allegations, which are typically, I find repeatedly, a strategy to get dad out of the home. And that'll do it. The police will show up and he will be asked to leave. And then the whole vicious cycle starts where, okay, he's out of the home. And then, the partner may want him back in the home. It was just one emotional incident. And then it just starts spinning out of control. But put simply, no, there's no way that he can be forced out of that home or asked to leave the home unless it gets ugly. So I think the bottom line is don't let it get ugly. So you may be on the futon in the basement, but just don't let it escalate so that some third party, whether it be the police, the CAS, whoever, comes in and says, okay, toxic environment because of you got to go. Right. So it's very important.
Okay. On the issue of assault allegations, if you've been hypothetically speaking together for 20 years,
right,
and there are no previous reports of any assaults happening, and
right,
suddenly because of this dispute, and you want the guy out of the home, you make these allegations. How impactful is that to the situation?
The situation meaning the family court case?
No, the fact that the police would take the allegations seriously, and in most cases it has a negative impact on the husband, because in more cases than others, he has to leave the home.
Right, and again, as I mentioned earlier, when someone triggers a 911 call, a domestic call, and the police show up, they don't have as much discretion as they used to have, and that's just simply the way the pendulum has swung over the past few decades, where there's now a directive that if there's a domestic assault allegation, someone's getting charged, someone is being taken away, not necessarily held for a bail hearing, depending on the severity of the allegation. They may just be required to stay away from the matrimonial home until the case is dealt with, or until their conditions are changed. So it's a huge impact, obviously.
I know. Come on.
I see someone has their hand up, Christy White.
I do. I have a situation here that I'm the Indigenous coordinator for Voice of Men 360, and I have some questions from the Indigenous side. So as we know, we've got a lot of kinship care stuff going on. So one question that's been going on, I'll use my own case as an example. I'm a kinship parent. I have third-party custody order. The interesting part is I am co-parenting with somebody else. I am the one with the legal court order. And the interesting part is my court order, I know as a lawyer, it's surprising. I've had other lawyers ask me to send it so they can see, has one line. I have full custody. There's no provisions for parents or anything. Now, my question is, because we have so many of these type of cases happening amongst kinship families, what authority does that give when you have a co-parent kind of situation and only one has the kinship thing? Is it better, like, am I able to give, or anybody in my case, able to give the other parent authority, or is it best to maybe start application for basket adoption?
Well, at the end of the day, things only go to court or become an issue if people can't agree. I've had cases where, despite there being, and going back to the old terminology, where one parent had sole custody, interim sole custody, right? And technically the child was supposed to be with that parent full time, and the other parent had whatever it was, one weekend or whatever the case may be. If people are able to cooperate and talk in a civilized way, regardless of what the court order says, I've seen cases where people just mutually agree, okay, you know what, why don't you take the child for a week, or take them for more than every other Saturday. Everything can be discussed between parties. A court order only becomes an issue if someone wants to enforce it, right? If there's issues where there's a dispute. But if parties amongst themselves can agree informally, then they can make peaceful arrangements. I don't know.
When you say civil, behave civilly and peaceful arrangements, how do you address that with perceptions of those things, right? Like if you're in a biracial couple and you're the Indigenous person, or you're the person of color, the last thing you want to do in court is appear to be angry or have mental health issues or anything, because that's not a good situation to be in, right?
Right, for anybody, but I understand.
Yeah, for everybody. I'm just saying, like, perceptions of these things. Like, we're talking about allegations and stuff too. Like,
right.
Sorry, Christy, I don't want to cut you off if you want to keep talking. I see your hand is still up.
So let's rewind the tape, Christy. So what is the question really?
Okay, so in the way of men's issues and stuff like that, and actually I don't know how to take my hand down, guys. So after this, don't worry about it.
Okay, no problem.
The only other thing I was worried about is just how would say, okay, so in this case, I'm the woman who has all the legal rights, right?
Right.
And I mean, as you know, I'm part of this organization, so I don't exactly agree with having all rights. So my thing is like, for essentially Indigenous people and status, and when you start getting into kinship and stuff like that, to give you an example, the co-parent in this situation, because he has no legal documentation tying him to this child. We're having a hard time of the quote unquote father accessing stuff from his home community for this child because of how now the system has done all this kinship stuff.
Right, right. Well, one solution may be for the parent with the legal rights to have a document drafted which authorizes and grants the other parent access to school records or medical records. It's called a release. So for example, I have a case where, the father has sole custody, again, under the old kind of terminology. The mother really has very few rights or decision-making rights, but she's to be consulted. So in that case, the child's gone to an ADD doctor, for example. Mom wants to know what's happening. So, dad can sign a document that's then given to the doctor that says, I consent to you releasing information to this person, the mother, for example. So again, there's workarounds without having to go back to court. But if you have to go back to court, as I've said earlier, nothing's etched in stone. Parties can always bring motions to change based on a change in circumstances. Parties can also bring, enforcement motions if orders are not being followed. Again, I'm of the view that, you should try to work things out outside of court if at all possible, because once you're in court, it becomes like a non-ending, almost endless proposition for everyone involved.
And expensive.
Well, that's why I say, as soon as you've reached the courthouse door, you've often lost, right? And it's not just lost the case, you've lost financially, you've lost emotionally. I had a case the other day. I had one case, I'll give you an example. I had one case where everything was decided except for who picks up the child where, okay? You would think that is a simple, reasonable situation, especially when both parents live within 20 minutes of each other. But no, the mother was insisting dad does pickups and drop-offs, and she does nothing. And our position was, well, it's only fair if we have, again, using the old terminology, joint custody, that, we take, receiving parent picks up. So if it's your turn to get the child, you come get them. If it's your turn, you come get them. Seemed fair to me and seemed fair to my client. But no, we were on the precipice of a 10-day trial to resolve basically this issue. Before you have your trial, you typically have a meeting with a judge. It's called a trial management conference. So the judge just looked at the other side and said, you're going to spend probably 25,000 of your own money for a 10-day trial. You're going to end up losing because you're going to have to pay the other side's costs. So you really want to jeopardize your daughter's university fund over this silly issue? Ultimately it didn't go to trial. It got worked out. Receiving parent picks up. But again, it depends on how reasonable people are prepared to be. And sometimes, not sometimes, a lot of the times emotions do get in the way.
Can I just ask you to clarify one thing, Michael, for me?
Sure.
I was just a little confused on something. So because I have full legal authority under third party, right? I'm just curious because of course this could vary for my case particular, it could be done under mediation. Now, could we go to a lawyer and get something drafted up and that would still give them legal authority? Or is it because I was granted custody under a third party, we would have to go and a judge would agree to that person having like access rights or that kind of thing to the child?
Again, defaulting back to my standard proviso, I don't know all the details or history of the case, but it sounds like you'd likely have to go back if you wanted a court order in place. You'd have to go back in front of a judge to have that issued. Now, if everyone's on the same page and it's on consent, then a lawyer could certainly help in drafting all the documents, and it wouldn't necessarily have to go in front of a judge. It could be done on consent, meaning it gets filed with the court, the judge reads all the paperwork, then an order is issued based on that. So again, I don't know the specifics of your case, but it's sounding like you'd have to get something from the court if you're going to be going to different places and relying on that order, like doctors or schools.
Thank you so much. That's exactly what I wanted to know.
Cool. So I'm just looking at the time here. I think I'm gonna have to make some announcements about our upcoming shows and stuff before we get back into this call for closing for this episode, I think. If that works for you guys. So Open Up is our show that we run every live talk show every Wednesday at 6 p.m. and Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern time. Vili is a Tamil live talk show on Sundays at 8 a.m. We have a monthly webinar. This is one of them. Every first Saturday of every month at 10 a.m. where we bring expertise and organizations to discuss particular topics. Our monthly special show, The Unspoken Tears, the second Saturday of every month from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern. The focus is domestic violence against men, bullying, male sexual abuse, traumas, porn addiction, and human trafficking. The next show will be on next Saturday, March 12th at 10 a.m. Eastern, and the topic will be bullying, lateral violence, scars, lessons, and anti-bullying prevention. Bullying prevention? That's two negatives. It's going to be a panel discussion, 3 individuals sharing their experiences. Authors Circle is another show about authors who've been contributing to areas of men's matters around the world, and will be participating and sharing contributions, experiences the third Saturday of every month from 11 till 12 Eastern, noon. 6th is South Asian Men's Show, is the third Sunday of every month from 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern time. Voice of Men 360 and All Bengal Men's Forum will be hosting this show. We will specifically focus on the issues faced by South Asian men and create awareness. Each month will be different countries from South Asia that can participate. We have our podcasts available on all of your favorite streaming platforms, including iPhone and Google Play. And our monthly men's group meetings, for men by men, every 2 weeks on Tuesday from 6 p.m. till 7:30 p.m. through Zoom. The next one will be on Tuesday, March 8th at 6 p.m. Please join through Zoom. And finally, Pass the Talking Stick, Indigenous peer-to-peer support group, 4th Friday of every month from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. through Zoom. Please join on Zoom. The link is available on our Facebook page. So thanks for coming out. We are going to come back to our guest here, Michael Burry, lawyer. Did you have anything else that you wanted to wrap up for this section? I'm hoping you're going to come back out to talk more. This has been very insightful.
I'd love to. I think the one thing I always remind my clients where they're in the middle of a battle, for example, is sit back and think about whether 12 months from now, this dispute or this issue will still matter. If it's not going to matter, you got to learn to get past things. Again, self-care, focusing on the best interest, focusing on the future. A squabble over whether the kid shouldn't have had chicken McNuggets versus something else, let it go. It's not going to matter in 12 months, right? So don't get caught up in the conflict. That's the worst place to be.
Well, thank you very much for coming out. Do we have any more questions from the audience before we close this segment off?
Well, there are 2 questions though. One is from David and one is from Christy.
Sure.
So David says, hi, I was wondering about your thought regarding the court systems waking up to false allegations as a form of coercive and controlling domestic abuse. That's not a loaded question at all. Committed against the entire family. So we talked about that a little bit earlier. Did you have anything else to add?
Well, again, I find in the vast majority of cases, it's not a cold, calculated move against the family or against the other partner. It's often in the heat of the moment. It's, things have gotten out of control. They're usually building up and then they explode. There have been cases where it is a cold, calculated divorce strategy, as I call it, where people, decide, okay, I'm going to have this person charged. I'm going to set them up. It does happen. I've seen it happen. And I think the courts are waking up to it. It takes time, again, And it's going to take some brave judges as well to recognize that this is in fact happening and it's an issue. But we're getting there, I think.
Good. And we're talking about false allegations,
Yes.
not actual cases
Right.
of abuse and stuff like
Right.
that. If
Of
anyone's
course.
listening and hearing that, if it sounds like that to you.
Of course.
So do you feel the price for a lawyer when a dad is just getting on his feet could contribute to failed court rulings for dads? Like, do you think we're cheaping out because we're already under the bus for a bunch of money?
As I tell people, once you arrive at the courthouse door, the only people who win are the lawyers. It's not a good place to be. Family law litigation is expensive. I try to contain costs as much as possible, whether it's a reduced rate or a block fee rate, depending on the stage of the proceeding. But at the end of the day, my legal fees in many ways are going to be determined by the reasonableness of the other side. If the other side wants a long drawn out battle, then it's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. I've had cases where people have not only run out of their own money, they're going to their parents. Imagine you're 35, 40 going to mom and dad saying, "Hi, I need legal fees." It's a tough place to be. That's why, again, negotiate, mediate, avoid court. It's just going to be so much more cost effective. And a lot of people don't know about the mediation, but I think it can be much more useful than going to court.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for coming out. Today we talked about how is parenting time and access determined. Some other topics that we'd like to discuss if you want to come back in the future would be how to prepare yourself to co-parent, how child support and spousal support, key differences, how to deal with high conflict divorce, and the importance of self-care.
Love to come back.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And that's our show for today.